Hello everyone, this is Dusk Diver. Yushancho, I believe is how you pronounce the sort of subtitle that you see there. It's the name of the sort of alternate dimension area that a lot of the game takes place in. This game is a brawler, a 3D brawler in a style that I haven't really seen in a little while because generally speaking, like, you know, the whole hierarchy of brawlers, how they have evolved after the PS2 era, they sort of split into multiple types of games, and you have like the character action games like God of War, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, that sort of thing, that sort of branched off from them. And then the other end of them kind of started to just disappear off and eventually kind of seemed to solidify into like Metroidvania-ish influenced games and stuff like that. They sort of combined with the already present Metroidvania genre, and you have stuff like Hollow Knight. And I would say that games like Dark Souls as well also kind of take certain things from brawlers, that sort of 3D action RPG style combat. It has a certain amount of like influence from them, as well as the Arkham style combat that we had for a while. But this is a little bit different. This is more like a Dynasty Warriors game, or Samurai Warriors, or Hyrule Warriors, or whatever you want to say, a Musou style game, because it uses the same sort of control scheme where you have a string of light attacks and then a string of heavy attacks that can be chained off of those light attacks, and depending on how many light attacks you used before you use a heavy one, it uses a different one, so you have all these different combos. It'll be very familiar to you if you've ever played a Dynasty Warriors game. It's not, the gameplay-wise, it's not all that similar. It's very much like a sort of a stage-based brawler, but control scheme-wise and the way the fighting system works is quite similar. This game actually has a couple of kind of neat mechanics to it, though, like some of the things you're seeing right now. One of the things that they've done to add some variety to that style of combat is to give you these summonable partners. They're called Guardians. So in something like Dynasty Warriors, the variety in the combat comes from the fact that you have like a billion different characters with their own movesets. Every weapon has like its own weird exotic moveset. In this game, that is of course not going to be the case because you only play as one character the whole time, and she tends to punch and kick things a lot. So your combos, although there are a good number of them, they're the only ones you're going to be using throughout the game, so that isn't where the variety comes from. Instead, they add in this Guardian system where you can basically just press the B button if you're using a controller to summon one up during one of your attack combos, and depending on like where you are in the attack string, they will use a different summon attack. So for instance, you would do something like press XXY for like a light, heavy combo, or XXXY for like a longer combo that ends very differently, and every additional light attack button press you add makes the eventual heavy attack button press do a completely different attack. And then after that, you will then press B to summon the Guardian, and depending on how many sort of combos in you are to this attack string, it changes, which is pretty neat. You can just tap B by default while standing still, and it will sort of summon them up for like a basic forward attack, and every attack you add in after that will change their available combos, which is pretty neat and is a good way to add in variety to the combat when you're only using one character and you're using a combat system like this one. It's a pretty interesting way to do things because it involves a certain amount of like switching around for specific reasons. As you can see in the bottom left there, you actually have all of your Guardians with you at once you unlock them, so you don't have to choose just one for a stage or anything like that. You have them all, and you can swap between them at will. And each of their attacks have different capabilities, not only because, of course, they're different animations that do different things, but they react with enemies and armor and things like that differently. There are a lot of enemies with super armor, which is that sort of smaller gauge below some enemies' health gauge you'll probably see in the background, and that basically makes it to where they don't flinch very much, and you don't do all that much damage directly to their health gauge. You have to deplete this first. You do some like chip damage to them, but it's very low. And the different Guardians can interact with this in different ways. So the kind of main one you start with, this guy Leo here, is very fiery and very like sort of Brawler-esque. Just punches things and has like a weird fire-powered like pile bunker sort of thing, which is pretty amazing actually. And he tends to do huge damage to enemies' super armor. You can bash through their armor very easily with him. The guy on the left that I have taken quite a liking to his combos, they're pretty cool, uses a scythe, and he attacks in such a way that has like a lot more hit frames, so like he hits much more often, he builds combos a lot faster. And he also leaves like a damage over time repeated slash effect on anything that his scythe hits. So it makes the armor not regenerate very much. It doesn't do like tremendous damage to super armor, but it makes it to where it won't regenerate very quickly, if at all, which is very important for certain enemies that can regenerate it really fast. And then the lady character on the right here you're about to see is very watery. She's a fish, basically, and she uses guns, funnily enough, because, you know, all fish use guns. And she uses these mines as well that can sort of slow enemy movements and stuff like that, and her attacks are kind of like what you would consider true damage, and that oftentimes they just completely bypass the super armor. They ignore it. So if you have an enemy, for instance, that has just regained a bunch of armor but is really, really low on health, you might want to break out some of her attacks because she'll be able to just hit their health gauge directly and finish them off instead of you having to wait a while by depleting their armor first. So there is an amount of strategy to actually switching between the different guardians and the way that their combos work and the way that they interact with the armor from the enemies and things. So yeah, the game does have some variety and some strategy in the combat. It is not the most varied and intricate combat system that you'll find. It's not Devil May Cry 5. It's not anything like that, but it does do a fairly good job, and I'm a fan of the Dynasty Warriors games. I know that they're very repetitive oftentimes, and they are not fine quality entertainment. They are very silly, and that's part of what I love about them. In fact, I plan on doing a video about that specific topic pretty soon. But I am also aware that despite my liking of them, their combat systems can be simplistic and repetitive. So I appreciate the fact that they added another couple of layers to this one, some different attacks and things that you can do, and the whole Guardian system combos to make it more varied and have a bit of a longer lasting appeal, and of course have different strategies for different enemy types and that sort of thing. It's nice, it's nice to see a combat system that is simple, but not boringly simple. You also have a couple of extra attacks you can perform with them as you, there's a sort of a friendship system. You can eat meals to get special effects before you go on a stage, and you can also just do missions for them. And once this friendship meter builds, you're allowed to do a sort of side mission for each one of them, and it will unlock different functions for them. Like the first side mission you do for any one of the Guardians will unlock their aerial summon attack, which is usually really powerful, so it's definitely worth having. The second one will unlock a sort of follow-up summon attack, so if you just press B to make them show up, you can press B again while they're fighting, and they will do a sort of extra attack, or you can hold one of the bumpers and then press a different button to do that attack straight off instead of waiting for the initial summon first. And there are several other attacks like this, different extensions to their combos and other things that they'll get access to as you raise their friendship levels and sort of raise your bond with them, which is a cool way to do things. Again, it helps with the combat variety, and it also makes the overworld exploration more important because, as you can probably tell in the background, a lot of what you're doing in this game involves punching things. If you do not like punching things, this is probably not the game for you because you punch things a lot. But what I'm not showing yet, but will soon, is a whole overworld exploration bit right here, where you were in the normal version of that place, which is actually a real place in Taiwan. They've modeled very faithfully. They've even got permission from a lot of the stores to use their storefronts and things. Like there's even a Cold Stone Creamery there, which makes me want ice cream very badly. So there was kind of like a bit of a social aspect to the game, and the fact that they don't feel too separate. Like, the things that you're doing in the overworld aren't like completely narratively separate from the things that you're doing while fighting. They help each other, which is useful as far as the narrative goes. And you can do things like do side quests for people of all sorts that will upgrade you have basically like a devil trigger sort of mode. It's called D-Arms. You glow orange or sort of a gold color, and you become extremely powerful, and you get access to these special finishing moves once you unlock them. Every Guardian has one, but you have to unlock them through story progression first. And yeah, you can actually empower this mode by doing quests for people, which is kind of neat actually, because there's also a skill point system. As you're seeing in the background, you can improve various statistics of your own, including adding new combos to yourself, and you can improve the power of your Guardian summons. So it's kind of neat to have other ways to empower yourself that involve this whole social aspect to make it feel more useful. You can also, of course, like I said, eat, and there are also these various little collectible things to find, like stones, these dragon stones, which allow you to actually progress in the game. You have to have a certain number of them to go to each story mission. Generally speaking, it's not difficult to get that many, so it doesn't feel like you have to like break the pace and constantly move around and try to find the things because you're missing a bunch of them. And every level also has a bunch of them in it, and honestly, this is one thing I don't like about the game, and it's really just something that I don't like about games that do this in general. When they give you a bunch of things to find in the level, but also have a scoring system based around completing the level quickly, which means you basically are going to have to play a level twice if you want to both get a really high grade on it to get all the rewards and find all the collectibles and stuff in it, because some of them are actually pretty well hidden, and the level design in the game, although what you're seeing in the background now looks very straightforward and linear, it gets more complicated later on with lots of like floating platforms and timed switches and water hazards and stuff like that. So yeah, finding all of the extra little bits around the stage can take a while, which means you're not going to get the S rank time on the stage to get all the S rank rewards, which means, yes, you're going to have to play them twice if you want both of those things most of the time. I think a very, very good player could probably find a lot of the collectibles in it and also get a really good score on them, but I don't think they'd be able to do that all the time, especially because a lot of the things you can't actually get to at first, so you'll spend a lot of time figuring out that you can't actually reach them yet until you get other abilities. But still, it's not the biggest deal breaker in the world, but it is something that it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I find it annoying to have like contradictory level completion goals where you have to kind of go for one or the other. You can't do both. And the other thing that I would say that is not in the game's favor is the overall variety. There's, like I said, the combat variety is helped by this guardian system and things, so the combat isn't that bad at all. I actually find it a pretty fun, very kinetic combat system. It's a very agile game. You feel like you're able to move all around the place. Your character responds very quickly and very fluidly to all of your commands, and she's able to do all sorts of cool things with the help of your summons especially, so I don't have any complaints about the combat or how it controls, but the enemy variety is not that good, honestly, and that's very important, obviously, in a brawler, because you're going to be facing these enemies a lot, because fighting is mostly what you do, so having a good number of enemies is very helpful for the overall variety of the combat. And yeah, this game does definitely falter in that regard. It's not a huge game in general, so I'm not gonna give it a little bit of a pass for that, because this isn't like a $60 huge like AAA product. It's not what it is. But some of the variety I feel could have been, you know, kept a little higher by having some more enemies. You will be facing a lot of the same enemies quite repeatedly, and a lot of sort of just like blue, harder palette swaps of the same enemies. So that's a bit unfortunate, but it probably won't wear on you for too long, because like I said, the game isn't that long, and what's here is actually pretty enjoyable. Also, the boss designs are really good. That is one thing I have to say. They don't like reuse bosses or anything like that, so as far as like the boss side of the enemy variety goes, they're really well designed and they're fun fights. Overall, if you enjoy things like, oh man, what was that really weird game about like fighting people in their underwear in Akihabara? Akiba Strip? That thing? If you're fans of stuff like that, you'll probably like this, because you do have to have a certain amount of tolerance for like anime going into this, although I wouldn't say nearly as much as something like Akiba Strip, which is very silly and has a lot of underwear in it. This game does not do that. No panty shots for you here. So if that's a positive or a negative, it's kind of up to you. But it is a good brawler. It's a solid brawler that does what it does well, and there's not a whole lot of it, but what is here is fun to actually go through. And the combat, the main part of the game that you're going to be doing most of the time, is enjoyable. I don't find it repetitive to the point of, you know, not wanting to play anymore. The story is actually pretty well written. The characters are voiced in Japanese, but there are English subtitles, and they're well written. They actually keep the personality and the tone of the characters intact, which sometimes translations don't do that very well. They kind of take the personality out by making the translation very literal, so you understand what they're saying, but it's very clinical and kind of dry. This does not do that at all. The translation is really good, and the characters are actually pretty funny, especially the boss character, who is a hilarious, weird porcelain bear thing that hates everyone. And it's a pretty interesting game, honestly. It's small, it's a bite-sized brawler, and if that's what you're in the mood for, then I think you could do a lot worse, because it does what it does well, even if it doesn't do a whole lot. Like I said, the level design very much opens up later on. You have all sorts of various like puzzles and things to solve in the levels in terms of how to navigate them, kind of like you're seeing right here, only in a much larger spread out version, because this is just a small side mission to get more items in the shop, because the boss is very greedy. And I will say one other thing I didn't like too much is a bit of an over-reliance on jumping sometimes, because the jumping controls aren't that good. You're agile, like I said, but you're also kind of floaty in midair, so having to jump precisely between platforms doesn't feel great. It's not a deal breaker again, but it is. It's not as good as it could be, because it kind of relies on it too much sometimes, with like some fairly precision platforming that it just kind of feels like the jumping controls aren't quite up to. Luckily, that's a very small portion of the game, and most of the time you will not be doing that, but it is a problem when it shows up sometimes, because it can be a bit annoying to navigate with some kind of floaty feeling controls. Overall, though, I think it's a solid game, and I think that if you're in the mood for a brawler, then you should definitely look this way. It's a cool concept, too, to have this, like, realistically modeled Taiwan. We don't often go to Taiwan in games, and this even has the Kunlunian whole thing of, like, it's sort of like a Taiwanese mythology sort of thing. It's kind of interesting to me, honestly, and I don't know if I've seen it much in games, so it's cool to have a bit of a different subject. We're not in Tokyo, we're not in Akihabara, we're in Taiwan, and a pretty well modeled one at that, which is cool. So this is Dusk Diver, a pretty solid brawler that if you're a fan of 3D brawlers, you wouldn't want to miss out on, because there's some pretty fun combat here. It's available right now on Steam. I'll have a link in the description below as always, so you can head there and check it out at your leisure. Thank you guys very, very much for watching once again. If you like this video, feel free to hit that like button. If you did not like this video, feel free to dislike it and tell me why, so I can improve. And thank you guys again very, very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.